There's a current trend for things to not be housed just in the institutions. Psychology is coming out of the office. Medicine's coming out of the office. Spirituality is coming out of the buildings. I want to talk about 16 spiritual traditions. People like to call them religions sometimes. I identified many years ago when I was stretching different muscles that I could develop different parts of my personality. And they were parts that were either somewhat developed or not developed. But when they really went far into that way of being of that particular type, very unusual high spiritual states I entered into. And they weren't necessarily associated with my type. They could be with another type of person. So sometimes I would stretch really intensely and I could see that everything was perfect and that I understood that perfection was not just what I thought it was. And then other times I would become incredibly ecstatic where everything was special and beyond imagination. It was just so precious and intimate, everything was. And then other times I would enter into sobriety where I could see I could be very clear about whatever people were doing, and that if they were addicted to a substance, it was really because they were just missing a connection to a certain part of their life. And if they had that part of their life, then they wouldn't have that addiction. 16 of these showed up. So they include things like perfection and humility and bliss and trust and empowerment and affirmations. They're extraordinary states to be in. And once I discovered them, I would talk to people that were that type, and they could tell me a lot about those different very high states of being. And then it wasn't long before when I stretched certain muscle groups, that I started to identify that the personality traits that I was getting connected to, these high personality traits, were identical to personality traits of different spiritual traditions. As unusual as that sounds, when I stretched muscle groups on the outside of my leg, I started understanding and creating Judaism. Well, when you think about spiritual traditions, they're not, you don't find them on a tree. I mean, they come out of a person's interface with the tree, right? Humans are creating these traditions to have access into these different aspects of the universe, right? So I'm stretching muscles on the outside of my legs, and I had gone to a Jewish college, and I started exhibiting the traits of my good friends that were Jews. And I would start thinking like them and behaving like them and talk about the high things they would talk about. And then one day I was stretching muscle groups on the back of my neck and shoulder. And I remember having a conversation with a man that was of the Islamic faith on an airplane. And I really inquired about it and had him explain things to me about that because I had very little exposure to that particular faith. And then when he did, years later, when I stretched out these muscle groups, I started having that same perception into reality and started thinking in the same way. Now, I have an unusual background in terms of spiritual traditions. What happened was that my two parents came from different spiritual traditions, and they didn't want to have a religious war or a spiritual war on the house. And so they decided they would not try to get us, the three of us, their children, to enter into or be biased about any spiritual tradition. A very brilliant strategy. But then when we got to junior high school and high school, they would take us every Saturday or Sunday, anywhere we wanted to go, to a Catholic church or a synagogue, and then when we got old enough to drive, every Sunday or Saturday, whatever the religious holiday was, or that whatever day they celebrate their tradition in, I would go to those things, and I tried all kinds of different ones. And after a while, I kind of really liked the kind of free spiritual one, because everybody got to talk in there and it wasn't just one person that was leading. For me personally, that kind of worked better. And that only worked for a certain period of time, and then that also Just didn't satisfy me. And then I went to college and I took a course in educational psychology and educational philosophy. And we started studying Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism. I was like, wow, these are much more along the lines of what I actually am attracted and how I like to think. And so I started studying those different traditions. So since that time, and since having identified years later 16 genetic personality types, and these very high spiritual things they're connected to, I started to develop an understanding of these 16 spiritual traditions and the way they appear to me, regardless of what they are. Each one's like a pillar that holds up the roof top of spirituality. And if you go up that particular pillar, whether it's Judaism or Islam or Christianity or Confucianism or Hinduism, when you get to the top, you see the benefit of all of them. And you can see they're just different databases to explain people how to function really amazing as a human being. And some people like to climb up one of the poles more than the others. It just works for them better. But when they get there, they see the value in all the rest. And so, and you also see the limitations in each, obviously. Just like each person is an amazing person, an amazing type. And they're really great at some things and not so good at some other things. So spiritual traditions are like that also. I love the diversity of the spiritual traditions. I think you can learn so much from the different ones. And most people think you'd have to go and participate in those spiritual traditions to understand them. They come from within your body. You can generate them from within your own body, besides participating externally in their traditions or in their practices. That I don't think people know they can do. I would love you to know that. They're all equal. That's what I discovered. And I hope you find that you're equal to everyone else also. Have a great time.